Yn hawn da pawb. Emily Lowthian dwi'n darlledydd ar adran addysgu a phlentod yn Prysgol Abertawe. Dwi'n siarad yn Chymraeg a'r Saesneg, felly dwi wedi gweud dwi ddim siarad yn Cymraeg am 4 blynedd nawr, so it's ddim yn rhugl o gwbl, ond byddwn ni'n trio. So I'm going to talk about my research in a little bit of Welsh, but mostly English because I'm relatively new to Welsh. I'm not very good at code switching. But today I'm going to talk about my research looking at care experienced young people's educational outcomes in Wales and also their pathways toward educational outcomes. I'm going to showcase a little bit of kind of the background just to get you to understand kind of the context, but then mostly focus on the actual findings themselves and the recommendations that we currently have for Welsh policy. So I'm going to keep an eye on the time because I'm just strict instruction. So firstly, just looking at kind of the existing work or kind of gwaith o hanner terrible symptoms of gwaith blaenorol. The research shows basically that children in care have poor educational outcomes and experiences. So lower grades over time in reading, maths, and it starts as early as age 7. And if we look at English research, as early as reception. So the disparities start really early, likely due to kind of caregiver inconsistencies or difficulties with caregivers and instability in early childhood. So there's been a number of strategies really in Welsh Government, started mainly from the Raise and Ambition strategy in 2016 following the Social Care Act in 2014, that looks at kind of how do we raise ambitions and aspirations for young people in schools, what can schools do? We also looked at the Legacy Report in 2021, which talked a lot about kind of the structure and the political landscape of children in care and what kind of we need to go forward. There also was kind of an integrated report by Sir Alistair, again in 2020, 2021, but that really has been the kind of end of where we see a political strategy from Welsh Government in terms of educational outcomes. So we really do need to revitalise that strategy, and I believe that this research will hopefully provide some context on the kind of Welsh landscape of children in care and educational outcomes and where we can go forward next. So to talk just briefly about this research, I do kind of talk about it as my research, but it's a collaborative effort between all of the researchers that were on the beginning slide, but also through lots of different people. So I suppose the most important, I think, really were the children from Cascade Voices, our care experienced learners and children who talked about kind of their feelings towards the research, and I'll reflect a little bit that on towards the end. We had teachers involved in this project, social care kind of associates, government officials as well, all fed into kind of the implementation of this project, the dissemination of the project, how we interpret this project, and why this project is so important. And essentially what we did is we followed all children in Wales, who were born between 2000 to 2003, and we followed them right up until they were age 16. So this is one of the first studies, to my knowledge, that's been able to follow children from birth all the way up to age 16, because we know that there is a problem with the data in Wales, really, in all nations, but particularly when we look at earlier data for children in care. This study is really revolutionary in that sense, and we owe a lot of this to kind of very technological developments in SAIL, in able to kind of access, I suppose, samples of children without getting too technical around kind of how we did that. And what we were mainly interested in is understanding care experienced learners' Key Stage 1 outcomes. So I say Key Stage 1 because at the time we didn't have a foundation phase. Key Stage 2 and also risk factors for GCSE attainment. And mainly what we wanted to understand is not just do care experienced children do perform worse or better, to put it simply, but also to understand what factors of care kind of relate to educational attainment and why. So we used lots of different factors of care, including placement type, the age they came into care, and the duration into care in relation to their education and attainment, to really get a very detailed understanding. And I think one of the difficulties seeing this is that you will find the work is very detailed. I'll try to give a relatively simple overview, but we need that detailed overview because it's not helpful necessarily to know how well children in care do when we know children in care have lots of different movements, pathways, and experiences of the care system. So we need this kind of qualitatively quantitative work to boost and enable our understanding. Felly in fy ymchwil, yn ni fo ni dod o hyd 6 grwpiau. So in our research we found 7 groups. If we follow children from birth right up until kind of age 7, we find seven pathways into care. The first one is adoption, mabwysiadau, and we find that adoption meet Key Stage 1 outcomes. So we find that all adopted children are meeting Key Stage 1 outcomes, which is really positive. And it aligns a lot with kind of English work as well, which is, generally speaking, quite comforting to know that it's kind of similar in that sense. We do find if we look at kinship care and children who are on mixed placements, so that's being with parents, being in foster care and kinship care, all yes, there are slight differences, but generally speaking, they're around 20 percentage points under the nationally expected level at Key Stage 1, which is around 83% at the time. I think the two biggest things that stand out in this really was the children who were reunited with their family. So quite often we'll see research that tells us children in short-term care arrangements who go back to their family tend to have poor educational outcomes. But we don't find that in the early years. We find that actually in the early years, children who reunited with their family actually doing a lot better in education than was originally thought. Yes, there's still a 20 percentage point gap, but they still are progressing. And this is really positive because it means actually with a few more support, with a bit more intervention, we can raise those children's ambitions to reach national expectations. For foster care, I think is kind of the biggest point to me. Foster care really matters for children who enter care just before going into school. So if children are going into care right before starting reception, only 40% of them are reaching Key Stage 1 outcomes. So I think the research offers some positives, but it also offers some areas where we do need some more tailored support and some more tailored intervention to support children. And if I look at this in terms of adolescence, what we did here was we followed children from birth then all the way up to primary school and said, what are the groups that we find on the left and what are their educational attainment on the right? I think you can probably see quite quickly that we do see this decrease in progress over time. Now, obviously, we are following children for longer in this analysis, so that means that we are taking in more children who go into care later, which we know has a kind of poorer relationship really with educational attainment, just often due to kind of longer term instability. Later stage entry to care often means kind of more behavioural problems rather than family kind of dysfunction. So there are complexities around this. But I think the biggest thing that you can probably notice is that adoption kind of sinks down then into 60% being Key Stage 2. And we know Key Stage 2 is really important for kind of secondary school transition. It's important for streaming. Streaming relates to educational outcomes, what exams you can be entered into. So we can see like lifelong impacts really with that. We also then essentially see what we call this kind of narrowing of progress for children in care, where children in different, despite different care arrangements, are starting to do really between the kind of 42 to 48% on average reaching Key Stage 2. And Key Stage 2 attainment in general population at this time is 81%. So we can see quite a big gap, essentially around half. And the children who are most at risk really are the children who are reunited with their family, not early on in life, but later on in life. So children who enter care around 8 years of age, go back to their families, only 36% of them are meeting Key Stage 2. So our research really does highlight the differences around kind of placements, timing, and the importance of age on entry. And that essentially kind of tells us a little bit more about the reasons of why you go into care really matter in terms of educational attainment. Yes, makes kind of obvious sense, but we can't assume anything until we have research behind it. And this is what this research does. So in terms of, I suppose I need to move on a little bit. What we also wanted to understand is, and I think this is probably be the most interest really to policymakers, is what works for children's GCSE outcomes when we look at different care groups. So if we look at all the different care groups that were on the previous slide on the left, we wanted to understand what were these groups' GCSE outcomes and what things predicted their GCSE outcomes in terms of school experiences. And if I just go over some quick kind of, I suppose, headline statistics. On the left, you can see kind of what our sample statistics are. So 75% had SEN. It was the SEN system at the time, not ALN. 5% had mental health problems. This is an under-identification, issues with the data. 50% had free school meals. 35% were suspended or excluded. And on average, 93% had average attendance, which is pretty good. But we know that there are all sorts of issues around the system and how people gain the system to present attendance as higher than it actually is. So some really interesting things about the data there. But essentially what we found is that obviously 14% achieved GCSEs, so undeg pedwar cant wedi cyflawni tuag at y 5 statistic, what of course in Cymraeg. But I think the most important thing really here is that poor school experiences are really important for children who are in short-term care arrangements. So things like school moves, free school meals, suspension or exclusion can explain the link between their specific care experiences and GCSE attainments. And this essentially means that those are the things that we need to think about as educational kind of policymakers and social care policymakers. What can we do to reduce school meals? What can we do to support children in poverty? And what can we do to reduce the number of suspensions and exclusions that are happening? So this leads me on to the recommendations. That I suppose the first one really is to end exclusions for care experienced young people and promote collaborative managed moves where parents, carers, and everybody is involved in kind of deciding where that child goes next, and there should be a child-centered approach. We need to improve data sharing between schools and social carers so children don't relive trauma, When I speak to young people, they tell me that whenever I go to a new school, I have to tell people what's happened to me. I have to tell people I've been in care, and that's really awful. We collect all this information anyway. There's no reason why social care can't share that with educationists. So really have files of children, so children don't have to do that. They can go to a school and things are already in place for them. We don't transfer PEPs and stuff like that. They take ages. They shouldn't. They should be readily available. They're on the system. And it shouldn't take good schools to do that. It should just be a system that happens. In addition to that, we need to expand the virtual school model. And there's significant success happening, for example, in Rhondda we can do that. England do it at a statutory level. Scotland have implemented it. As in Wales, we are falling behind. We're not doing our children justice by the kind of hybrid system that we have going on that's not consistent. We know that the virtual school model works. We don't need more research on that. That's no longer shared. We need to implement it. And I think one of the biggest things really is that we need to broaden the recognition for children in care to have support. So not just children who are in care now, but children who are care experienced. And we need to implement a renewed strategy for care experienced children's educational attainment. Diolch yn fawr.
So the grassroots initiatives and with support of community networks, including food banks and libraries, the concept of warm hubs, warm banks, warm spaces, amongst other names, took off during 2022, supporting post-pandemic recovery, as well as responding to the cost of living crisis. As the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice explained in a funding announcement that year, warm hubs would provide a safe, accessible, warm environment to help people reduce the cost of heating their own homes during the day. 3 years later now, the issues which drove the growth of warm hubs clearly remain. The Welsh Government reporting a quarter of Welsh households living in fuel poverty. And last winter, the National Energy Action Cymru reported over 50% of adults in Wales were expected to ration their energy usage below the levels necessary for comfort and well-being. And with Ofgem recently announcing a 2% increase in the energy price cap from October this year, policymakers may once again be considering options to alleviate the burden of fuel poverty. Furthermore, warm hubs usually offer a drink and Sainsbury's food. A survey commissioned by the Food Standards Agency found a quarter of respondents were food insecure, with the figure for Wales being slightly higher at 27% than England, 24%. With the Food and Drink Federation warning last week that food and drink inflation can hit 5.7% by the end of this year, and the continuous rise in food bank usage, warm hubs can potentially alleviate the tough choice between heating and eating. The Welsh Government initially committed £1 million in funding for warm hubs across Wales, stating they should be open and inclusive, responding to local and cultural needs. Over 850 spaces opened across Wales, from libraries, community centres to church halls, usually staffed by volunteers, reportedly providing support to over 117,000 people. Many hubs continued past the winter period, and in response to continued demand, a further 1.5 million was made available by Welsh Government via Welsh Local Government Association to the local authorities last October to support and expand safe and warm places for people of all ages to access within their local communities. Now over 5,000 spaces exist across the UK according to the Warm Welcome campaign, with their website highlighting many of these available in Wales, which you can see. For some reason, a lot of them seem to be via the borders, but I think it's the way that the algorithm works it out. Anyway, so whilst warm hubs may seem by some as a short-term measure, which fail to address the structural problems of poverty, I have found in my research that there are additional benefits to warm hubs worth considering. Indeed, it was clear from my qualitative research in Swansea, and I'm pleased that Cabinet members are here from Swansea Council today, that Swansea spaces, as they call them in warm hubs in Swansea, are much more than just warm hubs. So I was privileged to speak to over 40 people from several warm hubs and thematically analyse these with conversations alongside questionnaire comments collected through the local authority. And this was followed by a co-produced animation, and we can circulate the link of these findings, and a community event to discuss as well, learning from warm hubs. And I want to share 4 key themes that I found through this qualitative research. So, examining this safe, warm, and welcoming universal offer to all residents, I found warm hubs largely met their intended aims. The rollout of the scheme was found to be beneficial in responding to the cost of living crisis in a post COVID Wales, but it also contributed to the safety and well-being of communities. For some, this was their only social activity that they would join during the week. You can see here from these participant comments, now I'm claiming benefits. I don't hardly leave the house. It's nice to come somewhere. You didn't need to put your heating on all day, and it was the company. Otherwise, you're at home and you're on your own. So participants recognise the benefits of these hubs, responding to energy poverty, having a hot meal, and other financial issues as well, so they could access the internet, for example. Secondly, warm hubs were seen as safe and inclusive spaces. Hubs were described as safe spaces, attendees felt safe. They were seen as inclusive, open to all without judgment. Again, as seen as in this quote, participant highlighted the importance of community figures visiting the hubs: local councillors, police community support officers, local area coordinators, support workers. It enabled them to raise local issues and access support. Plus, PCSOs could further contribute to feelings of safety within the community. Thirdly, welcoming or connecting spaces. As welcoming spaces, an overarching finding was that the hubs were perceived to have broader societal benefits in developing social connections, promoting inclusivity, and reducing social isolation. As this participant said, it's not about the coffee, or not simply about the coffee, it's about engaging with people in the community. Residents spoke about the real importance of having company, especially post-COVID, reducing isolation, making friends and new connections. And a third of the participants also talked about that in terms of increasing their own sense of well-being. Research supports the benefits of social relationships on well-being, including improving mental health. Warm hubs also promoted digital connections and inclusion, including offering free SIM cards or online access, although older attendees really preferred the face-to-face contact that hubs provided. And finally, learning spaces. Participants saw hubs as learning and enabling spaces, providing information, activities, signposting, accessing community support, learning about local activities, even getting involved in activities at the spaces themselves. Swansea spaces were seen as informal support and providing sources of information, particularly for those who are not online, particularly for those older people. Opportunities for volunteering and skills development were also highlighted. And 2/3 of the coordinators had said they'd engage with partnership working of the scheme. So, those hubs working with other groups and organisations within their community. So whilst overall participants painted a really positive picture of warm hubs, some issues were highlighted. Participants were concerned that not all people who could benefit from attending the hubs were actually accessing them. So was there an issue with awareness because hubs are being promoted online, transport in terms of accessing the hubs, or potentially the stigma of need and help? Now, we know that many of the hubs, including Swansea itself, have got different names. They're not always called warm hubs, and that does help around the stigma. But of course, people who are experiencing poverty, experiencing the stigma of poverty, might find it difficult to go to these spaces. It was suggested at the community event that further research could consider access and inclusion within warm hubs and their role within broader long-term strategies for increasing inequalities in communities. So how do warm hubs work and interact in their communities? I'm particularly interested in my further research, which I'm conducting currently, around the overlaps between warm hubs, community hubs, and other policy areas, including public health, inclusion health, health protection messages, for example, local support for homelessness, and even people on probation and other marginalised groups. For example, another hat that I hold is convener of the Wales Probation Development Group, a group of academics across Wales and former practitioners in probation, with the opportunity to devolve probation in Wales, increasing local commissioning and local working, initially through a memorandum of understanding. How could warm hubs increase social capital and support desistance from offending? So the follow-up research that I'm undertaking into the role of warm hubs in supporting their communities will continue up until 2027, and as part of a European support transition fund as part of the Wales Institute of Social and Economic Research and Data. And I'm really pleased for the support of Wizard in terms of helping me continue the research into warm hubs. So this will include an all Wales survey, so expanding, not just looking at Swansea, but what's happened all across Wales around warm hubs. Further qualitative research as well with people who coordinate, support, attend, and crucially don't attend the warm hubs but may need them. And a planned outcome of the research will include warm hubs guidance for Wales, I hope. So to conclude, some recommendations, if I may. Given the ongoing costs, so the ongoing concerns around food and energy costs, coupled with the broader benefits of warm hubs, policymakers will be considering further funding for warm hubs. I suggest that warm hubs development overlaps, and warm hubs indeed overlap with a wide range of policy areas, or could potentially interact in more detail with these policy areas. Should further investment be committed, policymakers may consider the potential for maximising the use of warm hubs within their own portfolio area. For example, I mentioned there around devolution of probation. People who attend warm hubs also welcome the opportunity to speak to key community figures, and that came through clearly. Whether it's a local councillor, PCSO, etc. So Senedd members may consider visiting or even revisiting a warm hub in their local area to talk to their local constituents about local matters and the usefulness of their local hub. Diolch yn fawr iawn.